So remembering is more than just sitting passively. Remembering is more than just a doctrine. In Paul's mind, I think he intends that we should be translating this gospel new every day into our actions, so that when we leave this place, we come each Sunday to remember Christ, Christ in our midst, Christ in our hearts, Christ who lived and walked this earth, who died for our sins, who rose again. We're remembering that, but then we're leaving and we're moved to a greater act. Remembering begins, I think, properly with understanding. The understanding that Jesus Christ is indeed present here in our midst. Whether it's a communion Sunday and He's present in that bread and wine. Again, the doctrine of the real presence. I'm not going to get hung up on that. He promised He'd be there. That's all I need to know. We begin with the understanding that He's present, and from that presence we move out into life. It's no wonder to me that I look and I see so many people who are kind of wandering, lost, searching for stuff, grabbing onto things that they think are going to be meaningful. They don't have that relationship like you have, that I have. And I can say confidently, for me, it began in the water of my baptism. It might have begun for you in a different way. But the point is, as we gather today, you got to have that relationship. If you're going to understand what it is to know this presence that brings peace. The gospel reading today presents this great example. We've got lepers, and we could go and talk for an hour on what leprosy is. The leprosy of the Bible is not the leprosy that we see today. I think they call it Hansen's disease or something like that. Leprosy of the Bible, it was a variety of things that basically destroyed the sense of touch. I mean, you can imagine, you went to do what I did the other night. We were making a turkey last night, and so I went and I opened the oven door to pull the turkey out and check and see what it was, and I actually touched the pan, and it was hot. So I pulled my hands away, got a little burn. If you had leprosy, you would imagine grabbing that pot that's 300 degrees and not feeling anything, but you're lifting it off, and there's steam coming from your hands because this thing is so hot. And when you go to let go, you leave 4 or 5 layers of skin back there. That's the leprosy of Jesus' day. There are these lepers that are cleansed, and when it comes down to it, there's only one of them that comes back to give thanks. And Jesus makes a lot of that one because He remembered. Not just in a benign way, in a passive way, but He remembered actively that here was God who touched him, and that knowledge caused him to act. And his action was based on the truth of God's goodness and God's authority and God's power. You see, remembering, this is an element of our will. A will to perform the act. And it's backed by the knowledge of who it was that healed him. And it drove him to the point where he fell on the ground and he praised God. And even if he didn't do it eloquently, even if he just said, Lord, thank you, it was enough. Chris talked about that this morning. We're really good at the ask. We're not so good at the thank you. Much of the church today, I think, has retreated into just this knowledge sector of faith. We know that God exists, but don't ask me to go out and live my life as though He existed. That might make me uncomfortable. That might make you uncomfortable. It might turn people off. Well, people that go out and they do it badly, they go out and they live their life for Christ like they're swinging a baseball bat. That's no good. But this knowledge that we have, it should do something. It should cause something to be different about who we are and what we choose to do and how we act and how we respond. Do you remember back in the Second World War? I wasn't around, but I hear stories. I hear stories from my parents. I hear stories from my grandparents about how remembering what our troops were doing around the world to fight for freedom caused a very pointed reaction back home. Drives for scrap metal, rationing of things like tires and sugar and coffee, and gasoline. We were going without so that they could have the material they needed to do their job and to come home safely. That's the kind of remembering that Jesus moves us to, that Paul is talking about. And I wonder if we were to remember so well how badly we want peace in this world, how badly we want to live free, would it change what we do when we left here? There's a book called A Window on the Mountain by a guy named Winston Pierce. He tells of a high school class reunion. There's a group of them, they get together, old classmates, they're reminiscing about the things that and the persons that they were grateful for. And one man mentioned in particular that he was thankful for a teacher named Mrs. Went, because more than anyone she had introduced him to the joys of poetry and the beauty in particular of Tennyson. And so, acting on a suggestion, this man wrote a letter to Mrs. Went, and he addressed it to the high school. And the note was forwarded and eventually ended up to the old teacher. About a month later, the man received a response. It was written in this feeble longhand, and it read as follows: "My dear Willie, I can't tell you how much your letter meant to me. I'm now in my 90s, living alone in a small room, cooking my own meals, lonely, and like the last leaf of fall lingering behind. You'll be interested to know that I taught school for 40 years, and yours is the first letter of appreciation I ever received. It came on a cold blue morning, and it cheered me as nothing has for years. Willie, you've made my day." How many times do we remember like that? When God remembers us, He remembers us actively. He wipes away our sin. He restores us to grace. He restores relationships. He restores us to the life that our sin causes us to leave behind. How many times do we remember like that? When you leave here this week, when you leave here today, remember Christ. Remember Jesus, as Paul says. Not in the way that is passive and doctrinal, but remember Him really. So that if I were to meet you this week and you didn't know who I was, I would see Christ in you. It's not easy. And Paul understands. Paul was about to be sacrificed to that gospel. But yet as he writes this letter, he does so with a light heart. And I got to ask myself, how can that be? This man who is about to die, not even justly, how can that be? That he can be so light and so uplifted. I think he more than anybody knew what it was to remember Christ. And maybe we could do the same.